Welcome to our continuing series of virtual voices, focusing on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and hosted by World Information Transfer. Our speaker today is Mr. Felipe Carazo. He is the head of the Public Sector Engagement and Alliance Management at the Tropical Forest Alliance, World Economic Forum. With over 20 years of experience, he focuses on developing science-based sustainable solutions for environmental and developmental challenges. His expertise spans policy, governance, public-private partnership, and climate change, among many other areas. Previously, he served as Executive Director of Fundecor, advising Costa Rica's government on forest practices. He also worked for the Nature Conservancy and UNDP on sustainable initiatives across multiple countries. He holds a biology degree from the University of Costa Rica and a master's in environmental management from Duke University. Over to you, Mr. Carazo.
Well, first and foremost, greetings to everyone, and thanks, Dr. Durvak, for the introduction. And also, I wanted to thank the World Information Transfer Virtual Voices for the invitation to be here today and to share some perspectives, insights on how we're trying to tackle a very complex problem, which is deforestation, which happens very much on the ground, but it has implications globally. I work for the World Economic Forum, as you indicated, spearheading an initiative called the Tropical Forest Alliance, which is an effort through which we try to spark corporate leadership to address deforestation in the tropics. But before I go into details into what does this mean and what does this imply in terms of actions, what does corporate leadership, how does corporate leadership translates into collective action, it's important that we provide some framing of why deforestation is a complex challenge for humanity. When we see the challenges of addressing climate change and biodiversity loss, we cannot ignore deforestation. Net zero, achieving the Paris Agreement goals, achieving the reduction of emissions required by 2030 won't be possible if we don't address the nature component that is a source of emission. Land use change conundrum cannot be addressed if we don't look into the implications of soft commodities trade and its role in sustainability. What do I mean with soft commodities? When we go out, have dinner and try to, order for a steak, buy our shampoo, and it's produced with substances that are derived from palm oil, or we want to give our girlfriend chocolates in Valentine, the cacao that's part of those chocolates, and so forth. All these commodities that are really important in the way trade occurs across the globe. Some of these commodities come from the tropics, and mainly soy, beef, palm oil, with then cocoa, timber, and rubber and coffee. They represent one of the biggest drivers of deforestation for the world. So when we talk about addressing deforestation linked to soft commodity supply chains, is how do we make sure that our consumption practices in the downstream of these supply chains are able to have an impact, a positive impact, in the productive practices in the upstream of the supply chains, right? There's a series of stakeholders all between. In the upstream, you have the producers. The producers normally sell their product depending on the behavior and the nature of each crop to their own buyers. Sometimes it could be aggregators. There might be a manufacturing role in the early stages of the commodity. For example, converting cow into compound product that then can be exported. Things like that. And then you go into the middle ground of the supply chain where you have traders, these companies that are selling and buying out commodities, which, by the way, in this space, they're very important and strong stakeholders. Many companies that maybe you don't know, companies like Louis Dreyfus or AMD or Bungie, those names don't sound familiar, but these companies are very important private stakeholders in this space. There's one that you might have heard of, which is called Cargill. But further we go in the supply chains, we go from the traders all the way to the manufacturers of retail products. And that's where we have companies that we do know, we're more familiar with, like, for example, Nestlé, right? Or Unilever, right? That they have their own brands of products that we find in the supermarkets, and the supermarkets themselves are the retailers, where you have companies such as Walmart or Tesco in the UK. Well, those stakeholders play an important role. How do we go out all the way from the consumer that goes to that supermarket and create a transformative force that goes all the way down, or all the way up, if I might say, because we talk about upstream where the production takes place, and downstream where the consumption takes place, all the way up to the producer in such a way that this becomes a source of change. Consumption becomes a source of positive change in the production side of things. Now, in between, you have many dynamics, because you're talking about many sovereignties with a lot of countries involved in trade dynamics, in trade negotiations, so that the flow of goods between these private stakeholders takes place efficiently. But also you have financial institutions linked to this. Who puts the capital for the operations? So all these myriad of stakeholders have an important role on how to make sure that we can use the power of consumption in the right way for production, but in a way that it's sustainable. And when we talk about sustainability, it's not only how do you diminish the impact on the forest per se, but how you do it by not decoupling stakeholders from the supply chains. For example, in the last mile of palm oil production, we have in Southeast Asia, an area where there has been a lot of deforestation in the past, and there's still a high rate of deforestation, although it has diminished considerably. You have what we call the last mile, where we have producers in associations that crop the palm oil and take it to mills for this primary manufacturing. Well, if we have a strong pressure from the consumer end, how do we make sure that we're not decoupling the palm oil producers that might be in a higher risk of not fulfilling requirements that allows us to avoid deforestation? Well, how do we go about a process in which they can be up to the challenge and fulfill or adopt the right practices and evolve systematically, and not decouple them, and then they can continue to produce with bad practices, and the product goes to other markets that are not that demanding. This is what we call market segmentation. For example, with beef in South America and the Amazon, you might have supply chains that try to clean their act. Consumers of beef in Europe trying to demand beef that does not lead towards the land use change. But if you don't know how to deploy these systems, you might end up having the deforestation not imported into Europe, but having the deforestation taking place in the original site, and the product from that original site going to other markets such as China, where there's an immense appetite for protein. So I'm just trying to portray how the complexity of trade dynamics, commerce, finance, private engagement becomes variable of a topic that normally we put into the space of environment. You know, we tend to see things in, you know, in a two-dimensional thing. You know, okay, we look at the environment and the forest, and then we think about trade. No, all of this is intertwined. So the underlying causes of deforestation are very much linked to all these variables, and the way we address those variables is important. This is why multi-stakeholder dynamics are relevant to mobilize the private stakeholders, the finance stakeholders, the civil society organizations that can put pressure into these stakeholders, and build bridges with the public space to have the right set of policies that can bring both the stick and the carrot. What's the end game? This is how you put in practice by addressing this element, and I'm talking about one component of the broad set of components that have to do with, for example, the climate change agenda. But this is how you bring into action the implementation of tasks and the strategies to tackle the climate change. Why? Because if not, those emissions that are related to land use are going to continue to be occurring and having an impact in this space. The way we go about this, it's important to flag that although deforestation is the end game, we have to be very cohesive in the approach, because tropical deforestation occurs in certain ecosystems such as the Amazon, which is important, but you have other ecosystems around those ecosystems, such as the Cerrado. The Cerrado is a series of savannas in Brazil, where you have a lot of the productivity. So if you are able to work in that buffer area, which also has its own ecosystem uniqueness, in a way that you maintain the ecosystem uniqueness of the savannas, but tap into the barren land that already exists and create good productivity models that allow you to maximize production and minimize the expansion of to new areas, which bring the land use change, then that's how you start to put into practice a positive trend. Now, for that, we have to make sure that the forces behind are quite aligned, and the enabling environment has to be developed. Theoretically, we have a complex dilemma. When we look into our, we were talking with Dr. Durbach just before the call of Rio 1992. You know, that's a milestone in the way we, as humanity, decided to explicitly address the challenges of climate change and biodiversity and even desertification, and came out with the political framework to go about this and mobilize the countries into action, into policy development, so that the goods and services that are linked to this natural capital are of value. For example, goods such as this, you know, products that might be linked to the ecosystems, services such as pollination, services such as water provision, and so forth. Well, those frameworks need to be implemented through effective engagement. So normally, when you look into the climate change agenda, the biodiversity agenda, after many years of negotiations, we put together our implementation frameworks. The Paris Agreement is the implementation framework for the climate change agenda, and the Global Biodiversity Framework that was just set up in the Montreal Kunming Conference of the Parties is the one for biodiversity. This is the way, after many years, 30 years or more, that we as the world have put together the rules of how to address this. But the implementation is very, very complicated. What I was referring to, our work on deforestation-free commodities, is a very strong tool, and one that we have to really tap into as we move into multilateral spaces. But the theoretical element that I want you to take away is that when we go into implementation, we run into these problems of translation, it's very complicated. And I'm not saying about translating between Spanish and Portuguese or English and French, no, it's this is the translation of the developed countries and the developing countries. And if we don't take account of that, we can end up having polarizing scenarios that increase the transactional costs of putting into practice these implementation frameworks. In the context of deforestation linked to soft commodity supply chains, I'm going to illustrate this problem of translation. Well, if I'm a consumer of a good, if I buy my coffee or my chocolate in Europe and I'm aware of the climate change and biodiversity agenda, and I then, my power of as a consumer, it ends up driving through my choice the development of programs and instruments to try to make sure or provide credibility that that chocolate or that cocoa bean is not coming from an area that gets deforested. This is why we have certification models. We go to the supermarket and we find many brands of product brands showcasing that they have their own certification brand linked to it as a way of credibility. But that force, to transform that force into action, we go down to the upstream, and the producers and the citizens of many of those producer countries, which, by the way, are also consumers. And if you look at things like palm oil in Indonesia or beef in Brazil, Brazil is one of the main consumers of beef, and Indonesia one of the main consumers of palm oil. But in those countries, in those contexts, the lack of awareness, of consumer awareness, is not that depurated. And the producers themselves are far away from understanding in a tangible manner what are the impacts of climate change and biodiversity loss in their own producer models. The fact that I lose biodiversity can lead to a decrease of pollination that affects the rate of productivity of my crop in the future. But in that moment, the producer is very much concentrated into how do I make sure that we achieve productivity and livelihoods. So that translation between the consumer and the producer and on biodiversity and climate change and productivity and livelihoods needs to take place. We have to find and build the mesh, the conduit that allows us to demonstrate that there's a translation on a win-win. We try to build that in this space of soft commodity production by creating what we call our multi-stakeholder collective action approaches. We try to bring stakeholders from one end. We try to bring the retailers. Many of these companies that are retailers and manufacturers are organized on what we call the Consumer Goods Forum. Then we have the traders organized on other spaces. So we try to bring these stakeholders to the same middle ground so that they can discuss these issues and reach a point of communion, a common language. So, for example, we work with the Consumer Goods Forum companies in setting up strategies, roadmaps, linking to some of these crops, soy, palm oil, and trying to deploy instruments such as what we call jurisdictional action approaches, where we can go into the upstream, into the ground, work with stakeholders in the upstream, producers, local governments, and set up conditions for how we manage the resources on the ground, but linked to the consumer companies, the retailers, so that they can tap into that for their own credibility. And this builds a space for us to tackle the middle ground. So with the trader companies, we've started to create what we call is the commodity 1.5 roadmaps. What do these traders need to take into account so that when they buy the commodities, they can have tools to be certain that these commodities don't come from an area where there's a high impact in deforestation, and make sure that we clean the supply chains moving forward, and they can provide the right type of input to the manufacturer, and the manufacturer convert that in the chocolate or the coffee that we consume or we buy in the retailer firm in the supermarket. So this this machinery is very interesting, but it requires many levers. Some of them are financial, not only how do you mobilize the corporate leadership. Some of them are civil society organizations that are trying to serve as watchdogs. This is where the World Wildlife Funds of the world, the Nature Conservancies of the world come in, and they can provide insight of, the World Resources Institute that provides metrics on how the land use changes occurring, which are the hotspots. Are we losing forest in the Chaco region? Where and how? Well, where do we map out how soy or beef is produced in that region? Who is producing that? Who is buying that commodity? This information is important to try to push the corporate leadership into the right direction and make sure that the process of change occurs. In the other end, with the financial stakeholders, well, how do they manage the investments and the portfolios of investment? How do they go about the due diligence and the risk management so that they factor deforestation within this, as it happens also with the oil industry? So that there's no way to sustainability if we don't have this type of risks being managed within the investment portfolios, so that the capital that gets deployed to finance many of the operations of these trade routes, it's one that's demanding change. And then there's the interface with the policy standpoint, where we have to make sure, and this is where it in a way can be the other way around, not only the consumer forces, but also the corporates. If we have real corporate leaders that are setting the bar high, they can push for the right type of policies to reach the thresholds of change and to make sure that the level playing field is rewarded. It's created, and those that are in the lead are rewarded. We want those that take action to benefit from it. So there's been a big push to see how supply side measures and demand side measures can be developed in a way that these accompany the process of change. Now, this has implications because in some markets, the consumers are demanding change, but in others they're not. But sometimes the demand of that change, we have to be careful. Be careful what you really wish for, because a strong push, if a consumer market is highly aware and they push the governments to even take responsibility of the filtering of the deforestation equation out of the product that gets imported into the constituency, this might lead to this decoupling. This is in a way a huge topic of discussion today, because after many years, the European countries have decided to adopt what they call is the European Union anti-deforestation regulation, one through which any crop produced in Europe or imported into Europe has to prove all the way to the plot that there's no deforestation attached. So that's a good intention, that's a good instrument, but we think it's very important to accompany that tool with other complementary policies that create the right set of incentives, what we call our complementary policies and measures. Producer-consumer partnerships, international cooperation, finance instruments, traceability tools, so that then this can go in the right direction and we can bring everyone along, instead of having this being perceived as a trade barrier that might lead certain regions in Brazil to say, okay, we don't want to fulfill that, and China buys the beef, we're just going to export it to China, as I mentioned before. So, and as that happened, also the other markets, the emerging markets, need to be brought into the conversation so that we have a more cohesive approach on how consumption takes place. This is part of the strategies. I'm not going into details, but I'm just outlining in my concepts the strategies that we work on the Tropical Forest Alliance: public engagement, private leadership, finance engagement, multi-stakeholder connectivity, build up of capacity in the upstream through private public instruments and communities of practice, and so forth. So this is an overview of a topic that many of you are not exposed to, but it's there when we talk about trade and we talk about environment and we talk about food systems. Well, there's this mesh underneath that connects all these things, and the way we can mobilize the stakeholders through targeted convening, strategic communications, and thought leadership can help us try to frame out the conditions that could lead to positive action that can transform itself in net zero strategies on the ground, nature positive strategies on the ground that help us demonstrate that the goals and aspirations that we as humanity have outlined on our global frameworks to tackle and address climate change and biodiversity come to life. These are the manifestations of citizens' drives through government agreements that require more than government structures to be effectively implemented. We as consumers can play a role. I think that if there's another takeaway out of this conversation is that you as a consumer can play an important role in creating that consumer awareness that could lead to these processes, but also to do it in a way that has a balanced approach that allows us to do the transformations in such a way that we don't create a leakage, a counter damage that increases the impact that we're trying to avoid. I would like to also make a reference to the complementarity of these strategies with other strategies. So when you look at this type of logic, you can even think and adapt these concepts to emerging challenges, because we have been pushing a strong agenda on how to address the hard to abate sectors, the energy, the fossil fuel sectors. And that has brought to life new technologies such as electric vehicles and so forth. But that technology brings a different type of challenges because which are linked to other type of commodity chains. So if we're going to bring solar vehicles or solar panels, well, what's the supply chain of those products? And this brings new materials, new minerals, lithium, and that's starting to come to life with a higher level of demand. Well, where does those minerals come in? And if some of those minerals are linked to some of these tropical forest areas, should we start to take the blueprint of soft commodities and adapt it to that in a preemptive way, in such a way that we can help steer the development of those strategies to assure full sustainability? So that's one element that comes into life. And then other elements that come to life, well, if we're going to really try to clean the supply chains, let's say, for example, soy that gets exported from Brazil to China, can we start to pair to that supply chains the carbon footprint? How do we do that in a way that it also adds value to the development of the carbon markets so that it becomes another incentive, a right incentive for the producers, so that those that have the forest can see value for the forest. The natural capital equation gets triggered and allows us to make sure that there's the right transitions into enhancing the use of these resources at the base. Those are part of the challenges that come to life. And I will close saying that to do so, it's very important that we aim for balanced approaches. The extremes are always very tricky. There's a saying that says that in theory and practice are the same. In practice, they're not. Yes, I think that we have to be very tolerant and very intentional on how we develop these strategies, because it requires a lot of fine-tuning. The more we learn, we assess challenges, opportunities, we generate information. There's a iterative process of fine-tuning this strategy in such a way that we bring more stakeholders into the middle ground and not make it an ideological battle. This is the challenge of sustainability moving forward, and not to look at things in a compartmentalized manner. I will stop with this because I think that part of the session is to go into a more interactive conversation, picking up on what I've presented. So over to you, Dr. Durbach, to steer the next half of the session.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Carazo, for a very, very important presentation. And I think bringing awareness of the market systems and the fact that they do not focus on the importance of deforestation and also the differences between developed and developing countries is something that very, very few people are aware of. My question before we go for the questions is, are you using the AI technologies to teach about the commodity 1.5 roadmap to young people and university students so that they are aware of it?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and we're trying to address this more systematically. We are well, within the World Economic Forum, there's many agendas that we pay attention to. I'll just put it the other way around. We try to create the spaces for convening and discussion that try to spark many of these agendas, and we've been doing that with the AI conversation and making sure that the AI conversation becomes or the AI movement becomes a generator of tools for different strategies linked to nature and climate. So it's a cohesive conversation. Now, more specifically, we think that if we can bring AI into the buildup of now going to the specific issue of deforestation linked to soft commodity supply chains, there's a very important element that needs to be addressed, which is traceability. When we're looking at each commodity and how we are able to create confidence across the supply chains so that the impact can get measured and can be tracked, and therefore the engagement of the different corporate stakeholders in the supply chain is effective, requires a lot of management of information. And that's what we call traceability, and there's many different ways into how this gets developed. If we can use the advancement of AI into the system of traceability, that can accelerate, that can diminish the transactional cost of putting this and being able to respond to the demands of the market and the demands of the regulations. In the other end, how do we use AI to enhance the awareness, not only the awareness of the challenge, but the awareness of the good practice? We need the force of the consumer to make sure that the companies get rewarded by their actions, right? And I think that AI could be a way of accelerating and targeting that. I think the young generations play an important role because their preferences and attitudes are the ones that define the market. And therefore, those preferences and attitudes can be the ones that define the technologies that can provide the guarantees for that sustainable type of products in the market.
Well, thank you very much. That really elucidates what are the problems and how you can approach it. And now we will go to Susie Halleck, our moderator, for all the questions. So over to you, Susie.
Thank you, Dr. Durbach, and thank you, Felipe, for such a relevant and interesting presentation. We have a lot of questions that came flooding in. So to start, what do you think are the key components of a successful public and private sector partnership? Because they're often challenging and they sometimes don't go as you'd expect. So what have you observed to be like best practices to achieve a successful public-private sector partnership?
Yes, that's a fantastic question. And of course, there's no silver bullet to that. But what I would say is that we should not undermine the importance of architecture and design of any public-private scheme. You know, sometimes we tag things and to put together a dialogue and bring public-private voices is very far away from having a public-private partnership or scheme. So when you get into these efforts, and you know, they're always complex, and depending on what you're trying to address or target, it's very important to do the right build-up. And even within the private sector, let's say, you have to look for points of communion. How, using what I work as an example, or what I was discussing, how do you make sure that the retailers and consumers who have different type of exposure to the retailers or manufacturers who have a different type of exposure to the consumer, you know, these companies, they have the consumer breathing in their neck if it's a aware consumer. And the other set of companies, the traders, they're not exposed. You know, if I make a survey here, and who knows, Nestle, Walmart, Tesco, Unilever, Danone, it is, I'm sure we get different results if I make a survey of, who knows, Cargill, Bunge, ADM, LDC, etc., Olav, Cinermas, you know, because these other companies are not exposed to that consumer force. But imagine that the product that the retailers provide, you know, the capacity of assure that's deforestation free and please that consumer demand is very much dependent on how those traders go about their sourcing and their selling. So there's a need to make sure that private that set of private constituents are on the same page. So part of this design is how you build connectivity among those stakeholders so that you understand where does it itch, what's the challenge regarding traceability, etc., so that then you can forge the private-public interface to see how you go about the implementation of the enabling conditions to build together, you know, to build the right traceability framework. Because maybe you're in a jurisdiction that, you know, let's say Indonesia, and how do you create the rules of how you manage data? We've had companies that said, you know, I can prove my commodity down to the plot, but that doesn't mean that I can use that information freely because it's framed within the context of how information is used in XYZ country. So that's important. I will not undermine that. Then the other point that I can bring to your question is the private sector has can go deep into public with private agreements if we can think out of these issues that are very much linked to the common goods from a pre-competitive perspective. And Dr. Durvak was talking about water resources. In another effort that I've worked, I try to foster what we call our water funds, instruments to try to mobilize resources to the to sustaining water sources, financial resources to sustain water sources. But, you know, part of the success is how you are able to bring companies that are competitors in the market through beverages, for example, to be working together in the deployment of capacity that allows them to assure water catchments areas, because that's the prime product of their supply chain. How do they internalize that? In the deforestation-free supply space, how do you work with many of these companies like supermarkets and so forth, so that they can send the right demand signals, and that their own operations, which not only take place in aware markets like Europe, but they can take place in non-aware markets like Brazil. They can try to bring everyone on board in terms of the type of commercial approach to the product, taking into account each consideration. It happens also in the productive end of things. For example, because of the palm oil demand in Southeast Asia had to go deep into how to bring good practices. There was a fear that there would be a leakage into the African region. And we worked with African constituents to try to set what's called the African Palm Oil Initiative, which now has evolved into the African Sustainable Commodities Initiative. Prepared to make sure that whatever investment on palm oil in the region will not bring the old practices. Now, for that, you engage foreign direct investment entities, companies, and you have to be careful that you don't go the other way around, grant concessions, and then just decouple or move out of land local landholders. Well, maybe they can be part of the supply chains, but you have to adjust the productivity because a local producer might be, generating, I don't know, 5 tons of palm oil per hectare, and we need 10. Well, that's where the blended finance instruments come in, which are public-private instruments. But only if you are able to show how the private piece can bring the foreign direct investment, make sure that they give, they're open to buying out of the local producer, but the private piece. And the public piece can bring the complementary funding to make sure that that producer can evolve quickly from 5 to 10 tons per hectare. So this is the design and architecture of the private-public models is very important, because if not, we're just talking about goodwill, good manifestations. I don't know if this answers. I provided a lot of insight, but I think it's useful.
It does. Thank you very much. The next question is, Costa Rica is often recognized as a country that is exploring innovative options to achieve sustainable goals, and it's more advanced and mature in this space than some others. Could you please speak to what's driving this?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. It links to my upbringing. I'm from Costa Rica, and yeah, Costa Rica is it's interesting. It's a unique country because I'm going to provide 2 elements to this answer. One that looks into the past of why this happened, and one that should look into the present of, why it can happen in other countries, or how the Costa Rican experience can trigger things in the other countries. The reason why that happened, I like to say that has to do with what we call is the peace dividend. In the in the Cold War years, the Costa Rica, because of certain circumstances, we had abolished our army in 1949, and we were able to lock in a very solid democratic system, and we were able to deploy a set of social policies that allowed the enhancement of a middle class. And when we got to the 70s, in a way, this allowed the country to have certain margin of action. And when I say margin of action, it's basically a way of saying, there was a cohort of citizens that could be in a position to look for more opportunities. And that could be opportunities of knowledge, of formation. So a lot of citizens went and studied abroad and were able to bring ideas and concepts that led to the development of we were still quite a productive country. We were cattle production and coffee production were main crops. We still were changing land use, but because we didn't have this attention on other military conflicts, the capturing of ideas allowed us to take advantage of an opportunity when the prices of meat went down in the 80s after a huge crisis, and mainstream ideas of forest regeneration and restoration that allowed us to provide incentives, a way of starting to look into the natural services and goods that are linked to it. Now, that process, that's what we call is the peace dividend, and in a way set the foundations for us to compete. We were the economic boom in North America, especially in the United States, and the China, the Cuban situation And the peace dividend, you know, the fact that there was a Cold War all over, made Costa Rica an area of appetite for tourism. And we started to capture tourism, but around the, you know, offering beaches and sun. But this strategy of reframing the way we would go about land use allowed us to spark some creativity and develop an alternative product linked to the forest that was being regenerated, and that led to a win-win situation that enhanced ecotourism as one of the main sources of the economy of the country, and it reinforced the green model of the country. So that's how Costa Rica came to life. There's more and more to share. We could do a session on that, and I would love to share knowledge. Now, where is Costa Rica now? Well, we are very strong in terms of our green agenda, but we have still things to do on our. We have advanced on the blue agenda, these water funds that I kind of like made reference to. There's a lot to do on that, especially when we look into oceans. There's been a lot of progress as well, but we have to do more on the brown and the gray agenda so that we can have a more cohesive sustainability model. But on the green agenda, on some of these tools and instruments that we created, I think Costa Rica is in a position of serving as a source of knowledge for the world. And that has already started, you know, with countries such as, you know, quite diverse, like Namibia, like Bhutan, like Morocco. There's been a transfer of knowledge. But we can also learn from these other countries in terms of this brown and gray agenda, and bring practices to our space. Try to create Costa Rica on a breathing lab for the world that can continue to improve good practices that can be brought up to scale. Now, some of the practices in Costa Rica, you know, it's a small country. So we also need other countries. And this is like where Paraguay, where Colombia, where Argentina, now Argentina is doing in this agenda of soft commodities, is doing a marvelous exercise on how to tackle soy and demonstrate that soy traceability and soy can be put together in a win-win scenario. So what I want to say is that I want to invite the other countries, the other constituents, and especially professionals, to think that you can go to your own space of work and try to embed the principles of sustainability, not within a perspective of, I'm going to work here on a silo. No, or how you tap into these forces of trade, finance, productivity, policy, and create added value to your processes. I think that's important. We need more of that, and the framing for the climate change and biodiversity agenda brings that into the fore. The Sustainable Development Goals, they say that there's a potential market of $13.1 trillion for sustainability solutions down the road. So I could imagine many laboratories demonstrating this. And yeah, Costa Rica could be the green hub, but where we need the white hub on polar matters. We need the yellow hub on the certification solutions. That's the message to me.
Thank you. We received many questions around the media. So just to kind of pull them together, how do you see leveraging media best practices to kind of mitigate the amount of misinformation out there and to increase awareness around sustainability?
Oh, that's a good question. I've never received that question, and I've never thought about that, but you're right. It's the way the information flows changes perceptions, creates preferences, and might be a trigger or not of these forces of change. We have a saying in Costa Rica that says, in God we trust, everything else we need numbers, right? So if we can find ways of accompany these strategies, public-private schemes, you know, engagement of markets and you know, consumers and producers, environment and development, private and public, north and south. Let's try to bring data. Let's try to. This is where the interface with would it be academy, or would it be applied research instruments, technical entities become so important? Because if not, it's you might have a quick win, you might position your agenda, move forward, get some hurdles, but tackle some hurdles, but we're here for the long run, and those sound systems will sustain themselves if the results do the talking. But we need to use the media to accelerate the process. So if we can have grounded processes in which the information can be back in the discourse is important, and then you can build sustained campaigns of messaging that can provide truth proofing to things that's relevant. AI could be a way of doing that. It's a tool to accelerate that, and it's relevant. I will close saying, or giving a spirit to this type of approach by saying, it's we have to go slowly because we're in a rush. We have to make sure that this connects to the architecture and design, that we bring the right tools in place. If you have the right architecture and design, you bring the data, you have the instruments. Once you're trying to get traction through media engagement, you're able to have things that allow you to go far, right?
I really like the point you ended on in terms of the importance of balance, because usually the right answer or the close to right answer is usually in the middle, and finding a balance across all the parties involved. So how do you balance the economic interests of developing countries with the need for environmental conservation and these broader sustainable goals?
Well, this is a very good question. And when I made reference to the spark of these regulations, like we're basically in this space of supply, of soft commodity supply chains, we're in a very important moment where we're migrating from voluntary measures to mandatory measures. And this is being shown in different manners. And at the heart of that, we have this issue of producer-consumer dialogue with a lot of polarization. I think that how to enhance that, it requires a lot of trust build-up. It's not easy to do. And I think that it's important to be intentional on the approach, because if we have, let's say, consumer countries, northern countries pushing this development of these demand-side measures, how do we make sure that we have the conditions for producer countries to have the right supply-side measures? And at the end of the day, this translation equation that I made reference to, we have to be aware that the global frameworks have been adopted by all countries in most of the cases, but overall, that's why they exist. The Paris Agreement, all these producer countries have abided or have endorse those commitments. But if we want to make sure that we have beef produced rightfully in a frontier area, we need to make sure that we provide the right type of roads infrastructure, that we provide the right type of communications, that if we have bridges, they can be done with taking into account climate variability, that they can be, the adaptation can be deployed, resilience can be part of those investments. So these other tools that are linked to the climate change agenda should be factored in such a way that the deployment of these measures is not only how you engage the producer, how you create the right enabling environment so that then it can happen. And then the other thing that's very important, especially in these trade dynamics, is that when you have supply chains, yes, you have to trace, right, to make sure how you go about the impact and create the incentives and the leverages. But each connector in that chain has a power transaction. There's a power transaction, and you have to make sure that this balance out, because if not, you can end up transferring all the costs to the most vulnerable stakeholder. And that's not how it should be. That's not sustainability. You need to make sure that you go about and dissect the elements in such a way the transaction comes clean and creates the right type of incentive for change. If not, we're just going to have a never-ending game of challenges, and we're just going to enhance polarization with a lot of side effects in terms of poverty, migration, impact, land use change, et cetera, et cetera. So let's be intentional on how do we create the right type of conditions so at the different levels of the supply chains, we can have the interactions. And beyond the private scheme of supply chains, let's look at this between the North and the South, with the producer and the consumer countries. So let's have honest conversations, balanced approaches. Again, if the demand side regulations too demanding and too strict, because I am a consumer that wants everything clean. If I want to have a banana that doesn't have a freckle, well, it's we have to make sure that how we go about it, because at the producer end, for you not to have that freckle, there's a big chance you have to use the chemicals, the pesticides. Well, the same thing here with the trade. If I don't want anything, my coffee not to be linked to deforestation, yes, but let's make sure we go about it so that the coffee of my Chinese colleague is not linked to deforestation either, to the same plot. So those power transactions are important so that we are able to move collectively in the right direction. And I think the spirit of the UN and the spirit of the sustainable goals and the spirit of the Paris Agreement and the biodiversity Kunming-Montreal framework is that we move collectively in addressing these challenges.
As you're looking ahead, maybe the next decade or so, what do you see as the biggest challenges and opportunities in the field of sustainable forest conservation and soft commodity practices?
There's many challenges. There's tremendous challenges in the technicalities of the effort. How you are able to avoid how you avoid using like especially when you go into all these commodities, it's very easy to say one size fits all. No. But also it's very challenging to get diluted in such a way that you don't make any progress, because you're trying to, the perfect is the enemy of the possible. So there's this type of challenges which bring issues such as risk assessment, benchmarking, traceability, incentives, the appropriate payment with the finance sector. But if you ask me which is the biggest challenge, which is your question, it's how do we engage the new generations into the act? How does the power of the new generations through the information systems can be translated into the right type of choices that can help accelerate the adoption of policies in a balanced way? On the consumer or the producer end, it's very important, right? Because, we can solve the international trade conundrum after all these complexities, but 80% of the beef in Brazil, it's consumed by Brazilians. So if we can use the new generations who have a more universal language in accelerating that role of common awareness, let's say we have to reach, maybe the specificities of each crop are different, but the universal awareness is not. We have to aim for that universal awareness so that we move together.
Thank you. And could you please speak to what drove you to kind of pursue this interesting and impactful career, and maybe any advice you have for the students on the line who are interested in pursuing a similar career path?
Yeah, that's a good question. And this is how you go clean in life, right? I pursued, definitely I was very lucky because of how I grew up in a country and in a family that I was able to question. In Costa Rica back in the day, nobody studied natural sciences or things like that. You either would go into being a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. And I had the opportunity to question that out. And my country, in that process of change that I mentioned in the 80s or 90s, provide me with a space where, you know, I could feed my curiosity. So that was important. So maybe the first point is to have curiosity and try to see how you can feed that curiosity. You know, go and look for the elements that can do that. Then the second thing that happened is that they didn't came straightforward. No, I might have been exposed to this, but I didn't knew I knew I didn't want to be a lawyer or an engineer. But my excuse is I don't know what to study and I need some time off. And I took time off. I didn't rush into the decision. And I took 1 year off and I went to what my grandfather used to say, the University of Life. And it was not even in Costa Rica. I traveled around, I got engaged, I did other practices. I was very much into sports and did many things. I had to work in other settings that are not familiar, and that was very important. And even after 1 year of that, I still didn't know what to study or where to go to my career. But I went back and I said, I'm going to study biology. I'm going to be exposed to this beautiful country in this moment. And when I was in biology, I realized I was not an academic, but one thing led to the other. And I started to go into the issue of sustainability. And that's how I ended up studying resource economics and policy. And so that's my second lesson. Don't force things. Try to look inwards so that you can tap into yourself, so that then you can find the light where to move forward and move. You're not in a rush. And then the third recommendation, and I always say this to young people when they look for advice, is like getting into the forest, like this forest, and looking out for berries. You know, look for your berries as you move forward. Pick them up and put them in the basket. So my year abroad, my experience studying biology, my just don't one thing leads you to the other. Don't you and go about it. I was an assistant of cytogenetics. And that was a fantastic experience, you know, and I don't apply that knowledge, but you have to be forced into that. Don't think everything has to be what you want based on what you think at that moment. Go through those experiences, build upon them, because yes, me being an assistant of cytogenetics, I learned how to manage a situation that might be of help now. That's how you pick berries as you move forward, and you'll build a good career. And of course, that should give you the passion to move forward in your career.
I really love that. Thank you. And I think a great point to end on. So I'll turn to Dr. Durbach to close out.
Thank you very much, Susie, for moderating. I just wanted to mention that in 1992, when under the heading of Marie Strong, when we visited the indigenous people and talked about the deforestation at that time, there was a great deal of impetus to do something about it. The problem that, as you know, Brazil has a big problem with their populations. There's a great deal of diversity between the haves and the have-nots, and they have still not resolved that problem. And I think that that is one of the things why the entire input on sustainability and decrease of deforestation has not ended. And of course, it took over from the various different other countries that were in the Southeast Asia also. So that's number one. Number two, there's a couple other questions that came that I thought that you might want to address. And one of them is, are there any common misinformation and myths surrounding environmental issues regarding sustainability? And are they hindering awareness and actions?
Well, that's a topic in itself, but I would say, yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions, and I think there's a lot of people here still that think that the Earth is a bit flat. No, you know, we're talking about common goods here, and systemic systems, and systems are interconnected. And the more, and sometimes even us who work on this agenda, we tend to feed a problem, a situation that becomes a problem. We try, I don't know if it's because of human ego or our own way of looking at things, we try to build the environmental agenda as a pillar of its own. And I don't think it is. I think this is a social agenda. Like, we have to make sure that we mainstream this agenda in many of the economic, social, behavioral dynamics that we have, so that it can be effective. Yes, to get traction for the agenda, we have had to call it out, put numbers, put a face to it. This is important, but the way we move forward is like we get a good sense of that agenda and are able to start to mainstream this. This is why the Sustainable Development Goals are very important, because this is the way we provide some fibers, a mesh through which we can mainstream the agenda in an intelligent manner. Now, there's going to be resistance to that. And then this is where the misconceptions come about. But we don't have to feed that. We don't have to be there trying to see who has the best argument, because then we're just basically providing elements to have the agenda being seen as a siloed agenda that competes for the oxygen or for the space. No, this is how we make the other agendas much better, because we're trying to internalize the associated costs that come about that impact the common goods. So that's kind of like my take on that question, but definitely it's a space to address further, because it's the elephant in the room, right?
All right. Next question is, has social media changed the landscape of environmental advocacy and awareness?
Yes, it has. And I don't know if it's for good or for bad. I think I would like to say that for good. I think that we have a broader reach. We can understand better the global effects of local action. We can mobilize information faster. Of course, there's this misinformation challenge that we talked about it, but the inherent purpose and value of building connectivity across the world becomes an asset, right? How we shape the social media moving forward so that it's directed towards the good cause, it's a challenge. But we cannot say that we are in a lesser position of control. Yeah, maybe there's stakeholders there that can really manage the instruments, but I continue to believe that the human capacity of questioning things and being able to read through lines and push for the common good, it's stronger than anything else. This is how we've transcended many challenges as humanity by decades and millennia. So, of course, this is a new setting in a more globalized world and more interconnected, but let's continue to think that like this, if you want to go, how is it saying? If you want to go far, go together, right? If you want to go fast, go alone. Well, I think this is about going far, and it's about moving collectively.
That's a very good quote. And this is the last question. Can indigenous and local communities' knowledge and traditions be integrated into sustainable forest management? And what role do they play in conserving biodiversity and ecosystems?
That's a fantastic topic, and I worked in certain moments of my career with indigenous people close by, and it's a fantastic source of knowledge, and they are within the conservation agenda a very important stakeholder. also within the broader sustainability agenda, but the conservation agenda, when we look at land use approaches and try to bring the how do we lock in the natural capital in key geographies? They are the guardians of the forest in many ways, not only the forest, other ecosystems as well. And and I think that we just have to find better ways. And this comes to your point, Dr. Durbach, because this was highlighted in 1992. We just haven't had quite success of how we bring to life the knowledge that they have. I'll never forget when I went to a meeting in San Francisco to the headquarters of Google. And I was working in Costa Rica with an NGO that we were doing all these instruments for sustainable forest management linked to environmental services and goods, and trying to bring information and working with local campesinos, picking information from the canopy downwards in the forest. And we got into that room. You have this huge screen with 1 trillion data pieces out of Google Maps, mapping everything around. And the Google Map director asked me, what do you guys out of this NGO in Costa Rica bring that you think can add value to our purpose? And like, you know what? You have everything mapped, but you don't map below the canopy what's in there. And we could work out of the bottom up with communities to capture that out. And she liked the idea, and she said, you know what? This is what I heard from an indigenous leader in Brazil. When we came and worked with our Google Maps project, he said to me, well, you've mapped all the streets of Sao Paulo, but you haven't mapped any of the trails where we live. So that puts things in perspective. There's more than we can see. There's an iceberg and there's something below. And if we find conduits to capture that knowledge and that expertise and convert that into the fiber of that natural capital that's essential to sustain life because of all the services that provides regulated climate and so forth, we might have some clues for the future.
That is an excellent perspective to look at when we continue. So thank you very, very much for a very interesting and informative presentation. And we wish you going further in your exploring your own potential of Costa Rica, and of course, your assistance in helping make this world sustainable. Have a good week and
Thank
goodbye.
You very much. Thank you very much. And as we say in Costa Rica, pura vida.
Thank you.